All right. Now, in response to those first couple questions I asked you to explore or answer these two questions. Is history important? Why or why not? And then what is history? It's really important that we define what history is before we start learning about it. It'll provide a lot of context for how we're going to learn about it and why it's important in the first place. So, at least for our definitions, history is the knowledge that we know about the past and the way we discover this knowledge. So there's kind of two different definitions of what history is. One, it's this collection of everything we know about what happened in the past, as well as how we figure that stuff out. Most of us interact with history through books, movies, stories, etc., etc. In the quiz after this video, I'll be asking you how you learn about or interact with history. How is it affect? Do you learn about it? I'm sure most of you guys aren't exactly reading a lot of history books on your own, but how do you know certain facts about history? So think about that. Now, what can history give us? History is, well, ultimately important, but I don't expect you to take my word for it. We'll learn about why it's important and how it impacts our day-to-day lives throughout this class. So first and foremost, it helps us learn about other people and how they live, as well as learning more about ourselves. It provides moral understanding. It helps us figure out what's right and what's wrong, and to get better definitions of what is right and what is wrong. It provides identity, how we think of ourselves and who we associate with, is very, very tied to history. Uh, as well as it gives us practice with analyzing evidence, conflicting interpretations, and change. History is about using tools to figure out the world, and we get better at using these tools if we practice them. In history classes, probably the best place to practice these skills. And who writes history? Well, it's historians. These are people, they work often in like universities and colleges who study and write history. It's often said that history is written by the victors. Who historians are in the context that they're writing history in makes a big difference in what the history is. One of the best examples is Hitler. Today we look at Hitler and obviously he's bad. We think of him as bad. He is the example of the worst person in history. But why do we think of him that way? Well, because he lost. The historians writing about Hitler are from the US and the UK and Russia and all the other countries that were fighting against Hitler. Think about how Hitler would be portrayed in history books if Germany had won the Second World War. They would probably portray Hitler as a really good guy and like a revolutionary, someone who was a great leader. Who's writing the history makes a big impact on what the history says. And we use a variety of tools to add to what we know as history. Historians are essentially detectives. Detective, for example, they visit crime scenes and gather evidence, whether that be like bullets or DNA evidence or broken glass, and they put together the crime scene. Detectives interrogate witnesses who might have seen a crime or seen part of a crime, and they gather and interview suspects as well. And they use all these clues to figure out who did a crime and figure out what happened. Historians are very, very similar. They visit battlefields and dig sites and old cities and ruins to gather evidence about who lived there and, well, what happened to them? Why did they die? How are their lives like? For more modern stuff, they interview witnesses. For example, if you're learning about Martin Luther King Jr., you would interview people who knew him to figure out what he was like, what he thought. You'd also want to read some of his speeches, listen to some of his speeches, read the letters that he wrote, and that would give you an idea of his thoughts, his ideas about what his goals were. And like the detectives, historians piece together information to figure out what happened in history. Similar to how detectives have, the magnifying glass and DNA evidence and all that kind of stuff, historians have their own set of tools that they use to analyze the past and to write history. there are four kind of main groups, and then they split them down to several main groups. Oh, where's my little pointer? There we go. So first is chronological reasoning. Chronological means it's talking about time. So when we're talking about history, we're thinking in terms of what happened in the past. We're thinking of step by step what happened. It's about cause and effect, which is historical causation. We try to look at, okay, how did this event impact and cause this other event? And then that caused another event to happen, all because of that original event. As I'm recording this video, we look at the George Floyd protests and riots that are happening around the nation. What set those off? Well, it was this police brutality event that caused these riots and protests to happen. And it remains to be seen what the long-term impact of that's going to be, whether it's going to be no change or whether there's going to be change in how policing is done in this country. It remains to be seen. We can analyze continuity and change over time. It's a big thing to look at how people in the past lived versus how do they live today. People in the past thought a lot differently than they do now, as well as periodization. So we tend to divide history into like different eras. And we say, all right, this is the civil rights era, and this is the Civil War era, and this is Reconstruction or whatever. We do this to help organize it. It's important to understand why we split things into periods and eras to figure out what happened in those times. There's also comparison and contextualization. So comparison is, well, compare and contrast. What are the similarities and the differences between ideas, between people, between events across time? To carry on with the George Floyd protests, a lot of people are drawing comparisons between the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King Jr. and the protests going on with Black Lives Matter and that kind of stuff. And there are similarities between those two, as well as differences between those two. There's also contextualization, which is, as it says here, why did it matter at that given time in history? And that leads into some comparisons. The time period that things happens matters a lot. You got to look at this bigger picture of where an event happened to get a better idea of what happened, of why it's important in that time. The context of modern protests and Black Lives Matter protests are very, very different than the context of the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King Jr. These are very, very different time periods. And looking at the differences in these time periods can give us a good idea of what the results of these are going to be. One example, again, going with this just because it's in the news as of late, a lot of people are saying that the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter protests are not going to be super effective because of where the protests are taking place. During the Martin Luther King Jr. civil rights era, Black people and white people and poor and rich people tend to live a lot closer to one another inside of cities. They were separated, there was segregation, but they tended to live near each other. That Black people who fought for civil rights could go to white neighborhoods and white communities and protest and be seen. However, nowadays, the middle class and rich people and often white people live more so far away from the city. They live in suburbs. So these protests, Black Lives Matter protests, are often happening, but they're not being seen by white people, for instance. Of course, that's a generalization, but you get the idea. Then there's historical interpretation and synthesis. This is basically taking these clues that we gather and putting it all together, about interpreting them and saying, all right, when we put all these clues together, we put all the evidence together, what's going on? Why does it matter? It's essentially the same, going back to this detective argument, piecing together clues to figure out who did a crime. That's essentially what this historical interpretation and synthesis is. It's bringing all the clues together to figure out what happened. And then lastly, there's crafting historical arguments. There are a lot of debates in history about whether something's right or if something's wrong. And so we have this arrow. We go from chronological reasoning to comparison and contextualization. to interpreting the events and putting together the clues. Then we make arguments about history. And there's plenty to be had about whether certain things were right, whether certain things are wrong. Some people will say certain events happened, while other historians will say like that event didn't happen at all. And so there's a lot of arguments about this kind of thing. I think a great example of this is the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, where the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities. And it killed several 100,000 people. There's a lot of arguments about whether this was a good thing to do or a bad thing to do, whether it helped end the war or whether it didn't help end the war. And both sides of that argument use evidence to support their claims. So, following this, there's a quiz below this assignment. In response to the video, complete the quiz, and that wraps it up for the introduction.